You obey your thoughts, but do they represent you, hooked by the invisible master? You think your mind belongs to you, but what if it doesn't? What if what you call yourself is just a collection of reactions, voices, habits, impulses, none of which you truly chose? You wake up each day and assume the thoughts that greet you are yours. You listen, you follow, you act. But not once do you pause to ask who authored them. Were they created by your highest reasoning, or simply inherited from a world that trained you to think a certain way before you ever had the chance to resist? That's the trick. The control doesn't come with chains or commands. It comes dressed as your own voice. It whispers in your moments of silence, just when you're about to grow still enough to hear something deeper. It tells you what's safe, what's scary, what you're good at, what you'll never become. And you follow. Not because it's true, but because it sounds familiar. It wears the tone of your parents, the fears of your teachers, the doubt of your failures, the pattern of your past. And what's most terrifying is this: the more it repeats, the more convincing it becomes. Repetition is the enemy of truth, because the mind learns to obey what is consistent, not what is right. So you live your life obeying thoughts that weren't created by wisdom, but by conditioning. You don't examine them because they arrive early, loud, and disguised as instinct. You don't question them because questioning feels like a threat to your identity. But that identity was never yours to begin with. It was built from other people's fears, regrets, and limitations, handed down like a family heirloom. And now it speaks in your name. You wake up anxious. You think it's just how you are. You hesitate to try something new. You think it's a rational concern. You avoid discomfort. You think that's just being careful. But in truth, these aren't choices, they're echoes. You are reacting to thoughts that arrived long before you developed the strength to challenge them. And this is where the real problem begins. Because if you obey your thoughts without ever inspecting them, then you're not thinking, you're being thought, you're not deciding, you're being directed. This is the silent tragedy of most people's lives. They confuse mental noise with truth. They assume inner dialogue equals self-knowledge. But there is a difference between having thoughts and commanding them, between hearing your mind speak and knowing when to tell it to be quiet, between reacting and ruling. And unless you learn to separate the voice of reason from the voice of fear, you will spend your life in obedience to a master you've never seen. Every time you feel a sudden resistance, there is a thought behind it. When you shrink from a challenge, there is a command embedded within. When you talk yourself out of doing something meaningful, your thoughts are not guiding you, they are governing you. But here's the question that no one asks. Do they serve you? Or do they keep you small because they are outdated instructions written by a past version of yourself who was too afraid to dream? Your mind is a powerful servant, but it's a dangerous master. And the longer you let it run wild, the more it builds a system of beliefs designed not to elevate you, but to protect its own comfort. Your thoughts will defend your habits. They will justify your pain. They will rationalize your avoidance. They will present all of it as intelligence when it is nothing more than resistance wearing the mask of reason. So I'll ask again, but this time don't answer quickly. Don't reply with instinct. Just sit with the weight of the question for a moment. You obey your thoughts. But do they obey you? The voice that isn't yours. Most people spend their entire lives speaking in voices that do not belong to them. They wake up every day believing they are making choices, forming opinions, defending principles. But if you trace those thoughts back to their origin, you would find someone else's fingerprints all over them. Every reaction, every fear, every limitation you hold was once introduced by another person. Someone who planted it in your mind long before you had the strength to question it. The world trains you before you ever learn to think. It teaches you what to want, what to fear, what to admire, what to avoid. By the time you're old enough to form your own judgments, the system has already written them for you. The mind is a ventriloquist. It throws its voice through you, convincing you that what you hear is your own. But it isn't. It's a collection of recordings played so often that they now sound like instinct. When you hesitate to take a risk, that hesitation might not be wisdom. It might be your father's caution, your mother's fear, your teacher's doubt echoing inside your skull. When you feel anger at someone's success, That may not be your authentic feeling. It may be the voice of comparison that society injected into you to keep you competitive and insecure. Every emotion, every impulse that feels natural may only feel that way because it has lived in you for so long. You inherited your internal dialogue. The words you use to describe yourself were given to you. The way you interpret your failures was taught to you. Even your definition of happiness was scripted by a culture that profits from your confusion. And yet, you call this me. You defend it. You obey it. You allow it to guide you because it feels personal. But the truth is that your personality might just be a story told by others, a story you never edited. This is the illusion of ownership, the belief that your thoughts belong to you simply because they appear inside your head. But think about it. Does a bird own the sky just because it flies through it? Your mind is not a private space. It is an open field where the winds of the world pass freely. Family, media, memory, trauma, they all leave impressions, and you mistake these impressions for truth. You spend years trying to understand yourself, not realizing that the self you're studying is a collage of influences, a carefully constructed reflection of everything that has ever touched you. The Stoics warned about this. They said that the greatest obstacle to wisdom is the unexamined thought, the one that slips through consciousness unchallenged, wearing the disguise of reason. Seneca wrote that a man must stand guard at the gates of his mind as if protecting a city under siege, because every untested belief is a potential invader. Every unexamined idea is a silent conqueror. And once it enters, it begins to rule. The modern world has made this even worse. You are surrounded by opinions louder than your own. Algorithms feed you certainty disguised as truth. Every scroll, every notification, every video is a whisper, shaping what you think about and how long you think about it. You are being trained to react, not to reflect, to consume ideas, not to contemplate them. You are taught to echo before you ever learn to understand. And in this constant noise, the most dangerous thing happens. Your original voice grows quiet. When that silence arrives, you mistake it for clarity. But what you call calm may only be submission. The quiet mind is not always a free mind. Sometimes it is a domesticated one, tamed by years of obedience. You stop questioning. You start repeating. You live as the sum of the voices that built you, never realizing that you could have rewritten them. But here is the turning point. Once you see that the voice in your head is not entirely yours, you begin to separate yourself from it. You create distance, the first step to freedom. You start listening differently. You start noticing tone, origin, motive. You begin to hear the difference between the voice that guides you and the one that guards your prison. And once you hear that difference, you cannot unhear it. That is where liberation begins, not in silencing your mind, but in knowing which part of it deserves your obedience. Every thought demands attention, but not every thought deserves command. The voice that controls you only exists because you've mistaken familiarity for truth. The moment you question its authority, its power starts to dissolve. Now the question changes. If you can no longer trust every voice that speaks within you, how can you tell which one is real? The illusion of control. You tell yourself you're in control, that every action you take comes from a place of conscious choice, that you are the architect of your day, your reactions, your future. But let's slow down. Watch yourself for a moment. How many of your choices today were made from presence, and how many were simply repetitions dressed as intention? You picked up your phone without realizing why. You checked something not because it mattered, but because a small itch in your brain told you to. You said yes to something you didn't want. You avoided something that could have made you stronger. And still, you call this free will. This is the illusion we live inside, mistaking momentum for mastery. Most people aren't thinking, they're simply being carried by patterns. What you call your morning routine may just be a string of unconscious behaviors. What you call your preferences may just be your brain's addiction to familiarity. You believe you chose your path, but if you could trace your reactions, you'd find a script. Something happened in the past. You formed a belief. That belief hardened into reflex. Now it responds before you even realize there was a moment of choice. And this is where the truth begins to sting, because you are not controlling your mind. You are being moved by it. There's a chemical story unfolding behind every impulse. Your brain is wired to seek comfort, avoid pain, and repeat whatever has worked before, even if it slowly destroys you. When you delay an important task, you think you're being lazy, but it's not laziness. It's protection. The mind registers potential discomfort and pulls you away from it before you can consciously intervene. When you lash out at someone close to you, you think you're making a point, but you're not. You're just acting out a defensive script that began long before they ever spoke. Every time you feel guilt, panic, anger, or shame, there is a coded instruction behind it. Not a decision, a pattern. This is not about blaming the mind. It's about understanding its nature. Your mind is a survival machine. It is optimized for repetition, not growth. For efficiency, not awareness. It learned early what felt safe, what brought relief, what gave you the smallest taste of control in a chaotic world. Then it built walls around those experiences and called them identity. And now when something challenges that system, the mind resists, not because it is right, but because it is afraid. And fear always speaks first. The Stoics knew this. They spoke of pre-impressions, those initial reactions that rise without reason. Marcus Aurelius wrote that the task of philosophy is not to erase those impulses, but to pause, observe, and examine them. Because without examination, you are not a thinker. You are a puppet. Seneca said that to be free is to no longer obey the first command of emotion, to not flinch when struck by a word, to not tremble at the image of failure, to stand still when your old mind screams run. That is the discipline. That is control. But the modern world has seduced us into believing that reacting fast is a form of strength, that quick replies, hot takes, and instant gratification are signs of being in charge. In truth, they are signs of being controlled. The faster you react, the less you're thinking. The more you speak, the less you observe. The more you defend your patterns, the deeper you bury the key to your own freedom. It's not silence that makes you weak. It's the noise you never stop to question. Imagine your mind as a river. You are floating downstream, going wherever the current takes you. Most people live like this, believing they are swimming when they are only drifting. But every once in a while, something awakens. You pause, you look around, you realize you haven't been moving. You've been moved. And in that moment, something radical becomes possible. You stop. You begin to walk upstream, against the thought, against the programming, against the comfort. That is where the real work begins. To control your mind, you must first confront the lie that you already do. You must see clearly that comfort is not peace, that repetition is not growth, that knowing how to justify your behavior is not the same as being free from it. The illusion of control is the most dangerous prison because it looks like freedom. But when you pull back the curtain, all you find are loops. So now the question deepens. If the mind runs on patterns and those patterns are not truth, how do you begin to interrupt them? The thought isn't the thinker. You believe that because you have thoughts, you are the thinker. It feels natural to assume that what arises in your mind must belong to you. But if you truly were your thoughts, who is the one noticing them? Who is the witness observing them come and go? There is something deeper, something quieter, watching the parade of thoughts that pass through you every moment. That watcher is the real you. The thoughts are just visitors, loud, convincing, and temporary. They appear uninvited, demand attention, and vanish when unobserved. Yet somehow, they've managed to convince you that they are your identity. This is where most people lose themselves. They confuse activity with authorship. A thought appears, I'm not good enough. They don't respect me. I'll never change. And instead of recognizing it as mental noise, they pick it up and wear it like a name tag. The thought becomes the self. And from that moment on, every experience bends around it. You start to live according to the voice that least deserves authority. You become the shadow of an illusion. What you call self-image is nothing more than a collection of thoughts you once believed without evidence. The Stoics saw through this illusion centuries ago. They observed that the mind generates impressions, automatic judgments formed in an instant, and that wisdom begins only when we question them. Epictetus warned that the man who never examines his thoughts is destined to be ruled by them. Seneca said that the greatest victory is over the self that believes every inner whisper. These men understood that freedom doesn't come from controlling the world, but from mastering the space between thought and response. That space, invisible but powerful, is where your true self lives. Modern science quietly agrees. Neuroscientists can now see that most thoughts are electrical patterns triggered by memory, habit, and emotion, not deliberate creation. Your mind throws up possibilities the way the ocean throws waves. The waves aren't the ocean, they are its motion. In the same way, your thoughts are not you, they are your mind's motion. The one who watches them rise and fall is something else entirely. It is awareness itself. The sky does not become the storm just because the clouds pass through it. And you are not your thoughts simply because they pass through your mind. Once you grasp this, everything changes. You no longer panic when a dark thought arises. You no longer mistake anxiety for prophecy or doubt for destiny. You begin to see thoughts as weather, temporary conditions of the mind. When a storm comes, you don't accuse the sky of being broken. You know it will pass. The same is true within you. Thoughts lose their power the moment you stop obeying them. They feed on your belief. They dissolve under your observation. But detaching from your thoughts doesn't mean ignoring them. It means learning to meet them with discipline and clarity. When a thought says, "You'll fail," you don't fight it or obey it. You simply acknowledge it as a thought, not a fact. You give it space to exist without surrendering control. That's the practice of command, remaining unmoved while your mind moves. Marcus Aurelius understood this deeply when he wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events." What he meant was not poetic, it was practical. The world outside is chaos, but the real battlefield is within, where every moment you are tested by the thoughts that seek to possess you. Freedom begins when you realize that thoughts can be observed. Sovereignty begins when you realize they can be ignored. The thought is not the thinker. The voice in your head is not the commander. It's the echo of the past pretending to be authority. When you start to separate your consciousness from your commentary, you rise above the storm. You start to make choices that are not reactions, but decisions. You begin to think instead of being thought. Most people never reach this point because they spend their entire lives defending the noise in their heads. They argue for their limits as if they were virtues. They cling to familiar suffering because it feels like home. But the mind was never meant to be a prison. It was meant to be a tool that once disciplined can serve a higher order of life, one guided not by instinct, but by wisdom. So ask yourself now in full awareness, if you are not your thoughts, what are you? The answer is not in words, it's in silence. In that moment between thoughts where peace lives untouched. That is you, the thinker, not the thought, the observer, not the echo, the master, not the servant. Mental slavery in the age of freedom. You live in an age that worships freedom. Every screen, every slogan, every message tells you that you're in control, that you can be whoever you want, think whatever you want, buy, speak, become anything. But this is the cruelest illusion, because while your body moves through a world of choices, your mind is quietly imprisoned by forces you cannot see. You are not free. You are conditioned. And that conditioning runs deeper than most will ever dare admit. There was a time when control required chains, walls, and cages, but those methods are primitive now. In this age, no one needs to bind your hands. They only need to shape your thoughts, because if they can control what you believe, they control what you do. And the most brilliant form of slavery is the one where the prisoner believes he's free. That is the world you were born into, a world where your deepest desires were programmed by strangers, a world where distraction is injected into your nervous system and opinion is handed to you before you even form the question. You don't have to be told what to think. The system already knows what you'll click. The algorithm already knows what outrages you. The feed already knows what comforts you. You move through your day believing in your autonomy, while behind the scenes, invisible hands are shaping your mental environment with machine precision. Every headline you read, every ad you scroll past, every song, every image, every carefully calculated tone of urgency or pleasure is meant to do one thing: steer your mind without your awareness. They don't have to force you. They only have to influence you until you no longer remember the difference between choice and conditioning. You believe you're making decisions. But most of the time, you're just responding to stimuli. You crave dopamine, so you reach for your device. You feel a moment of discomfort, so you distract yourself. You disagree with someone, so you attack, defend, withdraw. These reactions aren't freedom, they're programming. You are running scripts, and those scripts were written by a culture that thrives on your unconscious obedience. The Stoics warned about this long before the first screen ever flickered. Epictetus taught that freedom does not begin with action, it begins with attention. If someone can control what you give your attention to, they already possess your future. Marcus Aurelius wrote that the soul becomes dyed with the color of its thoughts. But what happens when those thoughts were painted by someone else's hand? You begin to see the cost. Your mental landscape becomes foreign terrain. Your opinions are no longer yours. Your energy is spent defending ideas that were never born from your own silence. And that silence is important, because it's the only space left where freedom lives. Not in reaction, not in outrage, not in the chaos of constant consumption, but in the quiet refusal to be moved by noise. That's where the Stoic walks. Not on the surface, where trends scream and impulses demand attention, but beneath it, in the depth where nothing external has power. You believe you are free because you can express your thoughts. But if your thoughts were given to you, what exactly are you expressing? You say you are free because you can choose, but if your choices are shaped by manipulation, how deep is that freedom really? You scroll, consume, purchase, repeat, and all of it feels voluntary. That's the trap. Slavery in this age doesn't come with shackles. It comes with convenience. It doesn't punish you, it entertains you. It gives you a steady drip of comfort while it steals your clarity. It keeps you distracted enough to never realize that your mind was colonized. This is not a warning against the world. It's a reminder to return to yourself. Because real freedom has nothing to do with what you can say or buy or follow. Real freedom is the ability to sit still in a room, undisturbed by thought, unmoved by noise, and aware of what is truly yours. It's not in what you do, it's in what you no longer obey. The Stoics understood this. They didn't seek freedom in politics, fame, or wealth. They found it in mastery of the inner life, in choosing which thoughts to accept and which to let pass, in choosing stillness when everything screamed for reaction. The question is not whether you're allowed to think. The question is whether you know who is doing the thinking. Until you confront that, you will continue to live under the illusion of choice. You'll call your chains identity. You'll call your programming personality. And you'll defend your prison like it's a palace. So here we are again at the edge of a deeper realization. If your freedom isn't measured by movement or expression, but by the sovereignty of your mind, how much of it do you really have? From thought follower to thought commander. There comes a point where seeing the problem is no longer enough. You've realized that your thoughts aren't entirely yours, that your reactions are often reflexes from a borrowed past, that society profits from your distraction and fear. But awareness alone does not build freedom. It opens the door, yes, but the crossing requires something more. Discipline, presence, a willingness to confront what most run from. This is the moment when you stop asking for clarity and start building it, when you shift from being ruled by your thoughts to ruling over them, from being a follower to becoming the commander. This shift doesn't happen in a single realization. It happens in the quiet moments when you catch yourself about to obey an old pattern and you pause. That pause, so brief, so powerful, is the beginning of sovereignty. In that silence between stimulus and response, you reclaim what was always yours. Choice. Not the illusion of choice that arises after you've already acted, but the real kind. The kind that only appears when you are still enough to observe your inner world without merging with it. Command doesn't look like shouting over your mind. It looks like standing still while it shouts. It looks like watching a wave of anxiety rise without running from it, like hearing a judgment form and letting it pass without speaking, like feeling the urge to distract yourself and choosing instead to remain. This is what real strength feels like. Not control in the loud sense, but containment. Not suppression, but direction. Like a general in the chaos of battle. Calm, not because the chaos isn't real, but because he knows he leads from order. The Stoics called this internal command presence, a kind of moral posture, a way of holding your mind upright even when the world leans sideways. Epictetus spoke of training the ruling faculty, the hegemonicon, the inner seat of judgment, which governs everything else. If that inner command is weak, your entire life becomes a reaction. But if it is strong, you can face insult, fear, temptation, and even death itself without breaking, because your center is not located in the external world. It is built within. This inner command does not silence thoughts. It organizes them. It does not destroy emotion. It filters it. The goal is not to feel nothing. The goal is to feel clearly, to interpret with discipline, and to act with intention. To do this, you must stop treating every thought like a prophecy. Most of them are noise. You must stop responding to every emotional spike like it's a divine message. Most of them are habits. And you must stop telling yourself that because a feeling is strong, it must be right. Strength is not a measure of truth. It is a measure of repetition. So how do you train this command? You begin by noticing. You treat your thoughts like guests in your home. Some are welcome. Some must be questioned. Some must be shown the door. You begin to separate what is useful from what is familiar. You question the tone, the source, the intent of each mental impulse. And when you find the thought that seeks to dominate you with fear or urgency, you don't argue with it. You observe it until it starves from lack of reaction. This is how patterns die, not in battle, but in neglect. You are not at war with your mind. You are reclaiming leadership over it. And leadership is not loud, it is consistent. When you wake up and your first thought is dread, you meet it with stillness. When doubt rises before you speak, you answer it with breath. When a wave of anger flares, you feel it fully without feeding it. These small acts of command repeated in silence are how sovereignty is built. Day by day, moment by moment, thought by thought. Because in the end, a free man is not the one who thinks whatever he wants. He is the one who has learned which thoughts to trust and which to ignore. He is the one who moves not from impulse, but from principle, not from noise, but from clarity. He does not obey blindly. He does not follow the voice of fear. He rules his inner kingdom with calm authority, and because of that, nothing outside of him has power over what he becomes. So now, let the question deepen once more. If you could train your mind like a soldier, would you have the courage to give it orders it doesn't want to hear? Rebuild the inner Senate. Imagine your mind as a Senate, full of voices, opinions, and noise. Some demand attention, others whisper quietly in corners, some speak with logic, others with fear. Some are ancient, echoing childhood beliefs, others are recent, shaped by yesterday's failure. And in this Senate, there is supposed to be one ruler, you. But most of the time, you're absent from your own seat of power. You've let the loudest voices make the laws. You've let urgency, insecurity, and habit run your mental state like corrupt senators who argue but never lead. This is the hidden architecture of the human psyche. You don't think in silence. You think in layers of influence, internalized figures from your past, emotional residues from past decisions, social narratives that seeped into your inner monologue. Each one has taken a seat, and they vote on your future. You tell yourself you're making a decision, but it was decided before you even arrived. And you wonder why you feel disconnected. You wonder why you can't trust your intuition. You wonder why clarity feels so rare. It's because you haven't cleaned the chamber. You haven't reclaimed the throne. You've been reacting to noise instead of commanding with purpose. Marcus Aurelius lived with this metaphor deeply etched into his practice. He didn't treat his mind as a battlefield to be conquered. He treated it as a city to be governed. And like any city, it requires discipline, order, and daily inspection. He knew that if he allowed emotion to sit too long in power, it would corrupt his vision. If he let ambition shout unchecked, it would drown out wisdom. If he let pain speak uninterrupted, it would declare every challenge a threat. So he returned daily to himself, not to escape the noise, but to rise above it, to sit as ruler among the voices, not servant beneath them. To rebuild your inner Senate, you must first walk back into the chamber and see it for what it is. See who's speaking, who's dominating, who's been silent. You may find that fear has taken too many seats, that shame has become the speaker of the house, that your higher judgment, The part of you that knows what is right even when it's hard, has been silenced by habit. You must not panic when you see this. You must not run. Every mind carries its share of disorder. The test is not whether it exists, but whether you will lead it. You begin by listening, not obeying, listening. Listening with distance, with discipline, with the posture of someone who is there to decide, not react. You let the thoughts speak, and you wait. You let the emotions rise, and you don't flinch. And as the noise continues, you remain unmoved, not because you're numb, but because you're watching. This is how order begins, not with aggression, with stillness, the kind of stillness that commands attention from the chaos itself. In time, you begin to respond. You strip away the unnecessary. You silence the voices that have no right to vote. You strengthen the ones that speak from principle. You start to recognize the voice of wisdom, not because it's louder, but because it remains when all others fade. This voice doesn't beg for obedience. It doesn't shout. It doesn't flatter. It speaks calmly. It repeats what you already know in your bones. And each time you follow it, your inner order strengthens. You do not become free by killing your emotions. You become free by placing them under rule, by recognizing that every voice has energy, but not every voice has truth. You don't need to erase your history to lead your future. You need to govern it. You need to return to the seat of power and take responsibility for every command that leaves your lips, even if the thought behind it wasn't yours. To live like this is not easy. It requires vigilance. Most people won't understand it. They will call you cold, detached, distant. But what they don't see is the storm you refuse to let rule you. What they don't hear is the chorus you've chosen not to echo. What they will never know is how much noise you've had to rise above just to speak from a place of clarity. This is what the Stoics meant by ruling the self. Not by domination, but by deliberation. Not by force, but by presence. Your mind is not something to escape. It is something to lead. But you must lead it daily. Not once, not when it's convenient, but always. That is the discipline of a sovereign mind. That is the task of rebuilding the Senate within. So now the silence returns. And from that silence, one final question begins to take form. If you've reclaimed your place among the voices, what kind of ruler will you be? Final reflection. Return to command. You've followed the path inward. You've seen the truth behind the noise. The thoughts you once obeyed without question have been exposed. The instincts you once trusted blindly have been examined. And now you stand at a different threshold, not just of awareness, but of authority. Because now you know what most never discover. The mind is not your enemy. But it is not your master either. It is a wild force, powerful, clever, persuasive, and only when governed, only when observed with quiet strength, does it become your ally. You began this journey believing that your thoughts belonged to you, that they were yours simply because they spoke in your voice. But now you understand the deeper truth. Your mind is a landscape filled with voices you did not invite, with beliefs that entered without permission, with stories written by pain, repetition, and noise. You do not owe obedience to every voice simply because it echoes within your skull. You owe obedience to truth, and truth never begs. It never screams. It waits for silence. It waits for stillness, and only those who have reclaimed command ever hear it clearly. Look at yourself now. Really look. You are not the same as before. Not because something external changed, but because you stopped running. You stopped reacting. You learned to pause, to observe, to think. And in doing so, you proved something that cannot be taken from you, that you are not just a thinker. You are the one who commands the direction of thought. You are not just a feeler. You are the one who chooses what feeling deserves your attention. You are not just a product of the world. You are its witness, its filter, its sculptor. And that is no small thing. Most people never return to themselves. They live permanently outsourced, their minds colonized by media, culture, family, trauma. They speak of freedom while chained to impulses they've never seen. They defend thoughts they've never examined. They call their programming personality. But you, if you've listened with clarity, you have already begun to walk another path, the path of command. And not the kind that seeks to dominate others, but the kind that governs the self, that stands firm while the winds of emotion blow, that chooses discipline over drama, that returns again and again to the seat of stillness where truth lives. Marcus Aurelius once said, "Nowhere can a man find a more peaceful or trouble-free retreat than in his own soul." But he wasn't speaking of escape, he was speaking of command, the kind of inner structure built not on comfort, but on clarity, not on affirmation, but on awareness, not on performance, but on presence. You don't need to control the world to be free, you only need to master the world inside, and mastery begins not with force, but with refusal. The refusal to obey what does not serve you, the refusal to carry thoughts that poison your peace, the refusal to repeat cycles that shrink your soul. You now understand what many never will, that your greatest power is not what you think, it's that you can watch yourself think, that you can interrupt the momentum, that you can stop, breathe, choose. This is the power that separates man from animal, philosopher from follower, leader from prisoner. This is the freedom the Stoics lived and died for, not the kind that comes from conquest, but the kind that is untouched by the world's noise, the kind no tyrant can take, because it was never theirs to begin with. So ask the question once more, not from confusion, but from clarity, not from doubt, but from discipline. You obey your thoughts, but do they obey you? And if this message met you where you needed it most, if it reminded you of the strength you forgot you had, leave a mark, subscribe, comment, not because you were told, but because something in you chose to, because this is not content, this is training. Let silence follow now, the kind of silence only the sovereign can keep.